It's so painful to hear Trump describe the EU's economic power that way because Europe is that way because the US successive bipartisan generations of American leaders wanted it to be that way. And even when tensions are high, as they are, and European and American trade negotiators are super annoyed by each other, we all respected how incredibly important the success of the EU is for world peace.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. My guest today, Heather Hurlburt, is the former chief of staff in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative during the Biden administration and now a fellow at Chatham House. She is someone I've routinely turned to over the years for insights into broader geopolitical trends. In fact, Heather was my very first guest on the very first episode of this podcast over a decade ago. In our conversation today, we dig into the real geopolitical fallout from Donald Trump's escalating trade war and how the global balance of power is already shifting in ways that most people aren't paying attention to. Heather Hurlburt brings great insights from inside the U.S. government and from the international policy world. In our conversation, she explains why the trade war is about much more than tariffs, who the real winners and losers are likely to be, and what ripple effects we're already seeing across Asia, Europe, Africa, and beyond. We recorded our conversation live via Substack. If you'd like to join one of these live recordings, which I'm doing more and more frequently, please become a paid subscriber at globaldispatches.org. You'll have the opportunity to ask me a question, ask my guest a question, and generally watch these conversations as they unfold. For listeners of this podcast, I'm offering a 40% discount off the regular subscription price. Just go to globaldispatches.org/40% off. That's the word percent to access this discount or follow the links in the show notes of this episode. Now here is my conversation with Heather Hurlburt of Chatham House. Before we get into kind of the meat of our conversation today, which will focus on the broad potential geopolitical shifts that are being brought about by these recent actions by the Trump administration, I'd be interested in just having you explain to me and to the audience, just like the logic of having a rules-based trade system. Why was the trade system as it used to exist before a couple days ago created in the first place?
So there are two stages to how the trade system that we had until a week ago, and they each reflect kind of a different set of ideas about what is and isn't useful in international affairs. And the real foundations of the system come out of the immediate post-World War II period. And the idea that you had just had not just great power war, but in two enormously destructive global wars that were caused in part by instability that came from countries rapidly raising and lowering their tariffs. And the ability of the results of rapidly raising and lowering tariffs to absolutely wreck economies and take away countries' control over their own economies, such that sometimes economic concerns preempted a country making military moves before another country could do something to it economically that it thought it wouldn't be able to recover from. And so the winners of World War II got together and said, a minimum level of security and predictability is really important for all of us here. That's a very, very high level description of what's called the Bretton Woods accords that created the foundations of the financial system that worked more or less through the Cold War, but had to be adjusted a couple times. And this becomes important later because one of the main reasons that they had to be adjusted was that the US functioned fundamentally as the guarantor of the system, which makes sense because we had the largest and most intact economy after World War II by far. But a global system that's created when the US is 40% of the global economy starts to make a little less sense as other countries recover. Countries in the global south that had been colonies come online, figure out how to drive their own economic growth and become major players. So you have a couple renegotiations in the system. And then when the Cold War ends and the former Soviet countries also become interested in engaging globally, there's at this point the feeling that freer trade will both anchor those countries more firmly to the system of free market democracies. And in the 90s, there's this feeling of optimism that free trade and increased commerce will actually make those countries more democratic and more free. So it's on the basis of that optimism that basically free trade is going to lock in all the gains of the end of the Cold War and the democratic boom of the early 90s, that you get the system that we now have centered around the World Trade Organization, where when it was stood up, every country agreed on its tariff levels with every other country and agreed that we wouldn't change those absent a small number of situations in which you're allowed to use tariffs or absent negotiations.
You mentioned something that's not routinely included in, like, and I'm using air quotes, like the discourse about trade, which is the connection between trade and peace. That, trade initially and not having wild swings in tariffs was seen as a way to encourage peace and discourage war. It seems, these days we discuss tariffs through exclusively that like economic lens and economic prism, but there's like a broader connection here between free trade and avoiding interstate conflict that's at the heart, the root of this system.
Yes. So the pre global trade system period, the period that President Trump has been liking to talk about as he sees it as the great highlight of US history, is a period in which the great empires are using their military tools and their economic tools in tandem to bludgeon each other. And that the competition is, I mean, I don't want to make it sound as if they were less prone to error than we are, because obviously we had two world wars, but it was very much thought that those tools worked in tandem. And because that created two world wars, you then had the idea that we should try to separate them, we should try to keep the economic impacts out. And this hope grew up at the end of the Cold War in the post Cold War world that was called democratic peace theory. And the idea that, number one, democracies didn't make war on each other. And number two, the idea that integrated market economies wouldn't make war with each other. The idea that it would be too expensive for a country to go to war with another country. Now, I have to say, in the last 10, 15 years, that's been pretty comprehensively falsified. Russia and Ukraine's economies were about as closely tied together as you could imagine, and that inhibited Moscow not one bit. You see the situation between Taiwan pursued a deliberate strategy of investing in China in hopes of ramping down Beijing's military ambitions toward them. That has also not worked. The Balkan Wars, similarly, those countries were incredibly intertwined with each other. It didn't prevent super bloody wars. So, reluctantly, we're in a moment where the argument that we need the international trade system to guarantee peace doesn't hold as much water as it did. Although I will say, people who have criticized the idea that free trade equals peace, including me, didn't anticipate anybody coming along and upsetting the free trade boat quite this violently.
On that latter point, do you see the actions taken by the Trump administration over the last week as a fundamental break in that system? Is there like a system that existed prior to last week and a system that existed today?
Well, it's a culmination of breaks. I find myself tediously often quoting the F. Scott Fitzgerald, he went broke very slowly and then all at once. And the fact of the matter is, both Beijing and Washington have been undermining the spirit and the letter of the WTO Accords for some time. The way we set them up in the 90s turns out not to fit a world, A, where climate change and green efficiency is at least as important as overall economic efficiency, B, where Beijing needs to export at all costs to sustain its economy, and C, where the United States is struggling with this question of how much we want to reindustrialize and how much economic security we want. So, for all those reasons, and I'm not saying the US and China are equivalent in what we had done, but both sides have been doing things that factually undermined the WTO. The WTO hasn't was able to come to some minor agreements purely coincidentally while I was working at USTR, but it was no longer able to do big things. And this, undercuts the fundamental promise, which was that nobody would make rapid, huge changes that would affect the whole system the way we just did.
So I'm glad you brought up China because, prior to this week, the big, like, kind of, again, I'm using air quotes, like discourse in trade was around this concept of fragmentation. The idea that the world was kind of headed to two different trading blocks, one led by China, one led by the United States. Now, there are like variations in how that might take form. But, it was a trend that many observers kind of predicted would proceed. How do you see these actions by the Trump administration impacting that trend one way or another?
So, the practical impact of the tariff levels that the administration rolled out will be that the US is assembling a Western Hemisphere trade bloc around it, that the lowest tariffs the US will have, absent Britain and Israel and a couple of smaller countries. But the other areas where tariffs stayed under 20% are almost all in the Western Hemisphere. So it goes back to a very kind of 19th century spheres of influence model for trade. Then it seems clear, the tariffs we put on Southeast Asia stay where they are. We will have taken one of our most important trading partners and a region that successive administrations had taken a lot of effort to court economically and to say, we don't want you to feel stuck entirely in Beijing's court. We want you to have options. We want to be a desirable trading partner for you. And instead, we've said, no, we're not going to make any effort to be a desirable trading partner with you. So, unclear. Those countries have every reason to try to diversify for their own freedom of action. And as you can see with Vietnam and Cambodia, which moved very quickly to try to negotiate with the US, they want other trading partners besides China. So, it's an oversimplification to say that we end up with a Western Hemisphere bloc and a East Asia bloc, but there's certainly be a lot of energy that way. The great unknown here, Europe is able to
Yeah,
do.
that was my next question for you. So what has Europe done thus far in the immediate aftermath of the rollout of these tariffs? And like what are their options going forward?
So Europe attempted to start by calling Trump's bluff and proposed zero for zero tariffs. And I think everybody on both sides assumed that neither side actually could make that happen. But I will say it's been a great frustration on all sides for many years that although it seems obvious that there should be a comprehensive free trade arrangement between the US and the EU, and it seems obvious, back to your earlier point, that the foundation of a quote unquote trading bloc of democracies ought to be a US EU arrangement. There are a lot of institutional and cultural reasons why that has never happened, much to the frustration of everyone involved. So I think all of us kind of watched with great amusement as von der Leyen proposed that. And Trump immediately came back and said, no, we're not going to do that because you guys were, think he said, created to screw us. And it's with great effort. I'm using screw and not another word here.
This is a family podcast, Heather.
I do, however, I just needed to say that it's very interesting because US-EU trade relations are very tense. And for viewers who are used to being on the security side of the house and the Europeans were our favorite allies, on the trade side, that is not the case. There is an enormous amount of tension. However, the fundamental fact remains that giving the EU the security space to emerge and grow into the global economic and democratic power that it is one of the great triumphs of US security policy, that it was very much intentional, that the US wanted the EU to emerge that way, in part so there wouldn't be any more wars in Europe again that then the US gets sucked into. So it's so painful to hear Trump describe the EU's economic power that way because Europe is that way because the US successive bipartisan generations of American leaders wanted it to be that way. And even when tensions are high, as they are, and European and American trade negotiators are super annoyed by each other, we all respected how incredibly important the success of the EU is for world peace.
Do you suspect Europe to hold like a unified response to this?
The EU is trying very hard, but A, the Trump administration's interest to splinter them. And you have some European actors who, I mean, there are differentiated rates among European countries. So there's an overall EU rate, and then countries got different rates. And there are European actors who understand that they might be able to get for themselves a better deal. And so that's an enormous amount of pressure that the EU is under. And so I wish them the best, but it's going to be very challenging.
Well, I mean, that's interesting. In talking about and thinking through some of the geopolitical implications of this, it seems that like splintering the EU and having countries compete against each other in what's essentially like a collective action problem is one potential fallout from this.
The splintering that I'm worried about with the EU long term is if we get a couple more big countries that have seriously extremist governments, then you end up with kind of an EU of the right. I'm worried about an ineffective EU. I'm worried about an EU that's internally divided and can't be effective more than I'm worried about a splintered EU on the economic side because everyone understands that the unified EU is the prize.
So we've talked about China a bit, the EU. I wanted to ask you about the global south and the implications of these tariffs on countries of the global south, particularly in Africa. You know, like the mantra for as long as I can remember, and I'm sure throughout your career, was trade, not aid, right? The idea that, you know, frankly, one of the key missions of USAID was to build markets and developing economies of the global south to foster trade between the United States and those countries. But USAID no longer exists. And now we have these massive tariffs. So it seems that we're entering an era of neither trade nor aid.
So, something that has not gotten very much attention that this round of tariffs effectively does is sweep away a generation of preference programs, most prominently AGOA,
That's the African Growth and Opportunity Act.
which essentially allowed qualifying African countries to send their exports, to send qualifying exports to the US under much, much lower tariffs than they would have basically functioned as a free trade agreement. There was a similar global agreement called the Generalized System of Preferences, or GSP, that had already been suspended for a number of years because Congress couldn't get the votes together to pass it. This is back to my point that this had been falling apart for a while, that we had lost in the US the political will. Actually, we were continuing to say trade not aid and to run the programs that were supposedly trying to help our global south partners trade at a higher level, but we didn't have the political consensus at home to deliver as much of the preference programs as we used to. So on trade, though, the global south is not one entity. And so in some ways, it's really unhelpful to talk about it as one entity. You have, for example, Argentina, president of Argentina has already been, apparently they've already started negotiating with the White House about how they're going to get their tariffs adjusted. India, enormous economy, hugely, very protectionist by global standards, hugely complex economy. They've already come in with an offer. I don't know how seriously I take that offer, but they're trying to signal that they're very interested in negotiating. Smaller countries, as happens every time, and as I'm sure your listeners are used to hearing from the development side, it's going to be the smaller countries that are hurt the most, that they don't have a mechanism through which they can negotiate as a group. It's not worth anybody's time to negotiate with them one on one because their economies are so small. And in many cases, they struggle to keep up with the armies of trade lawyers that bigger northern countries deploy for any kind of negotiation. So I would say the very small and very poor countries that really made use of preference programs are going to be the ones that are most hurt.
So Heather, let's say a year from now, these tariffs, as they have been imposed, exist more or less in the same form. How is the world a different place? How has power shifted in the world? How have alliances shifted? What like trends will you be looking towards?
Number one trend is, what does Europe do? The EU has talked a good game about trying to reinvigorate and expand its own free trade agreements. Is it able to actually get any magnitude to do that? Or is it, frankly, riven at home by some of the same domestic political challenges we have? It's very unclear that their Mercosur deal can ever get ratified, for example, because of farmers and some other concerns. So what kind of velocity can the EU get up is one question. Does there emerge some kind of completely pragmatic new arrangement in the Pacific where a number of Southeast Asian countries say, hey, no harm, no foul. We've lost the illusion that you had our best interests at heart, but we can still coldly negotiate over things we make. And those tariffs come down, say, like by half to two-thirds to three-quarters. And you then have sort of a restoration of the place that Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, maybe Indonesia have in our markets. The real big question to me here is, are we going to have a full on trade war with China? Because if the US and China are having a full on trade war a year from now, that is going to have all kinds of ripple effects, including, by the way, undervalued, that Beijing will have to push its exports out into the rest of the global economy if it can't push them to us, which means more places seeing their own industries swamped and wrecked by Beijing's ability to manufacture at scale and subsidized. So then you see more unrest and more discontent in other countries losing manufacturing base. So those are some trends.
One trend I wanted to kind of run by you. I was speaking with a friend who, is in global business, and this person was, they have a global business, they have an American business, and now this person says that if they want to say sell their products in Mexico, they need to bypass the United States. Usually they would just ship it over the border from Texas. Now they need to go from Rotterdam to Mexico to, sell their products. And the broader point is that, this person foresaw kind of two different kind of systems for their company. One in focused on customers in the United States. The other system just focused on customers everywhere else in the world. And, it kind of leads me back to that fragmentation question. This wasn't like a US versus China thing. This was a US system for, selling to customers in the US. And then the rest of the world has its own kind of system and logistics. And I wonder if that is something that you foresee being replicated across industries.
So, throughout most of human history, there was quite a lot of fragmentation in trade, and there were regional systems. And you could argue that at various points there have been more or less global systems, the British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, layered over regional systems. And my guess is that we're going to go back to something like that. And I think also differentiating in size of company, right? That there will be a smaller number of companies, US companies, but also Chinese and others, that make sense to be truly global, because you have to be able to run complex, multifarious systems like that. And to be clear, that already existed to some extent. I think, we didn't, in fact, live in a world of free and totally frictionless trade before this moment. So only the very biggest and strongest companies will it make sense to have those kinds of systems, and others will end up more regionally specialized.
Before I let you go, any other final point that you wanted to make about this trend, this situation right now? A question I didn't ask?
So I want to actually come back to the security points, because I think I'm so grateful to you for jumping into this vortex between the two, and it's not talked about enough right now. I don't think today I can kind of point to the place where I think that economic tensions will spill over into military tensions. But if we look at history, we would be crazy not to think that's a real possibility. I mean, one obvious place is chips and critical minerals, where when you see a country or an alliance system feeling like it can't get access to what it needs, then there's a rapid ratcheting up of tensions from there. And I just think that's not thought about enough, because it feels like hoary ancient history from another time. But that's the thing I would keep an eye in the back of my head on.
Well, Heather, thank you so much for your time. And before I let you go, I do want to point out that you, Heather Hurlburt, were the very first guest on this podcast 13 years ago. Thank you for coming back again. It's great chatting with you as always.
It's so wonderful to have an institution that I can come back to like that.
Yeah, it's rare, which is why you out in the audience, please support the show with your paid subscription. It's how I've been able to do this for so long. And, I'm hopefully, between now and 13 years hence, we'll speak again several times, but hope to speak to you again soon. Thank you so much, Heather.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.